the Lord. And so as we dig into this passage, what a good launching point. And so as we look at these verses, my brothers and sisters, if any among you strays from the truth, and an interesting thing about that word stray, it's the Greek word planao, from which we get our English word planets. And so just as planets wander in the solar system, and yes, I'm telling you about one word that's has to do with space. If you can't tell by now, I'm a little bit of a nerd, and so I'm going to point out things like that. But just as a planet appears to wander through space, so we as humans sometimes wander away or stray from the truth. And in verse 20, when it says, let that person know that whoever turns a sinner from the error of his way, that word error it's the same root word. So they stray to error. And so as we talked about this last week, there's a couple ways that we can err. And I could err in or stray in belief or practice. That I could turn from God and the things that I believe, or I could live a lifestyle that even if I profess to believe the right things, I at least look like I'm not believing the right thing. So in belief or in practice. So this passage then, it's interesting, and there's a lot of debate. Is this talking about Christians, or is it talking about people who are away from God? And I think there's enough ambiguity that there's something in here for everyone. That if you're maybe apart from God, you've never surrendered to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, man, this has so much hope for you. But if you're someone who maybe there's a prodigal in your life, that they've been a believer, or maybe that's you, that you've been a believer and you truly mean that profession, but you're away or someone in your life is away, I believe this is for you as well. And so last week we covered 6 principles, and so they are in your bulletin. I'll just go through those very quickly before we dig into today's principles. The first one is keep hoping and praying. That I believe the Spirit of God is working on every person that's out there, whether they're serving Him and therefore He's empowering them, or maybe someone who's away. And I think of the book of Revelation that He is standing at our heart's door knocking and waiting for that fellowship. And so don't give up on people. Keep hoping, keep praying. Now I'm going to say one of the principles that we'll cover today might be what we fear and therefore sometimes give up hope. And I have to cover it because it's in the Bible and it's true, but don't give up hope. We're not God. We don't know what He's doing in a person's life. Keep hoping, keep praying. The second one is, as you talk to this person, confirm their salvation. In point 4, we'll speak to why in a second, but don't go and assume that a person is a believer. Sometimes we think, well, they've made a statement or they were raised, they know better. And so we have this assumption that they are a Christian where they may actually not be. And so I always recommend familiarizing yourself with the gospel of Jesus Christ if you're a believer. And what I mean is how to articulate it. We have really easy tools on our website. So if you go to troyfirst.com and click on our next steps and click on the one, I think it says, who is Jesus, something like that. Click on that, and there's a video out there that explains in less than 5 minutes, I think less than, I could be long-winded sometimes, but I think less than 5 minutes, how to understand the gospel. Man, if you're a Christian today, you ought to know the gospel, and if you don't know it, then go. Take that seriously to understand the gospel. So confirm their salvation. Number 3 was be cautious, that sometimes there's some real dangers when you're trying to restore someone. Maybe it's because of anger, that you have anger in your heart, or frustration or discouragement, or maybe you're susceptible to the same sin that individual is in. Number 4, distinguish between Christian and non-Christian. And so if number 2 is confirm their salvation, well, once I've done that, now I have a distinct approach that if a person is a believer, my goal is to help them to surrender to the lordship of Christ and into obedience and holiness. That's my goal with them. If a person's not a believer, well, before we clean up any behavior, I want them to come to a saving understanding of Jesus Christ. Number 5, speak the truth. Even though it's difficult and we must do it with grace, we need to speak the truth still. Number 6, be ready to forgive, because when you're dealing with a life circumstance, it can get messy, feelings can get hurt. Christian, be ready to forgive. And today, we're going to look at pitfalls that we need to avoid. So as you have this conversation, there's some very easy pitfalls. Now, we understand pitfalls in life in different areas. So one thing that I've mentioned before is that I'm really good at breaking things, not as good at fixing things. And so if you've been a homeowner or had your own place or just experienced someone who is a homeowner, and you've just seen that once you step into home ownership, the real, like maybe you have this fairy tale, oh, we have our home, but oftentimes what it is you end up saying, well, now who's going to fix these things? These things that inevitably break, don't care how new your house is, some things are going to break. Well, my very first house that we own, stuff just seemed to break all the time. It was a little older house, and then we did a live-in remodel, meaning we were living in it while we remodeled. I never planned to do that again. That was terrible. But I'm also not very gifted in fixing things, as I've mentioned before. So the demolition phase, no problem, but the restoration phase, a little more difficulty. So different things happened because I was the project manager. And so being the project manager, I knew one thing, our garage door opener quit working. So I thought, oh, that doesn't look that difficult. I could probably fix that. And so I went and bought a new garage door opener, and I was pretty proud of myself for a while. Took one down. I didn't get hurt by the high tension spring. That was a real opportunity for bodily harm there, but I avoided that. And so feeling really good about myself. And then how you hook it up, you hook the front, and then you bring the motor up to the power portion. And so I go to lift it and didn't realize that my house was on an older standard. And so it was, I can't remember if it was shorter or longer or whatever. So I put this whole thing together and bring it up to where it's supposed to be, and none of it fit. So I had to actually cut a hole in the ceiling, like build out a frame, move an electrical box. There were pitfalls. I thought, how hard is this? They come in a kit. I've played Legos before. I could probably do this. Turns out it was harder than Legos. Well, I wish that were the only thing, but there's another time where I was doing trim, and, I should think that there's pipes in the wall, but I didn't think that, and so I was in my laundry room, and I was just doing some trim around the baseboard, and I'm thinking, hey, there's a pipe going down here. You don't think about necessarily where it runs to. You just think, I'll miss this pipe. I was more cautious about electrical. I had a background in electrical, so I was like more cautious about that, but I'm nailing some trim down there, and all of a sudden I hear, and then before long, water starts to leak out onto my floor, and I realize, oh man, I'm going to have to tear a hole in my wall. Far from being pretty trim, now there's a hole in my wall. And then if you're doing baseboard, of course, that's very low to the floor. So because it's low to the floor, if you have a concrete slab, which my house was, then I'm afraid, can we even fix this pipe because the hole in it is so low? Luckily, the guys were able to, but did have to tear a hole in my wall. So pitfalls, yeah, we understand those. I understand them quite well. Well, there are pitfalls when we have conversations with people as well. So talking about the prodigal son last week, we can imagine, and maybe you've been in a circumstance like this, where maybe a well-meaning Christian wants to help restore someone, but the way they go about it just completely turns a person off. The way they go about it just makes a person either feel guilty or like they're judgmental or whatever it is. And so this many times sincere efforts of a person to try to restore someone end up backfiring and doing the exact opposite. We can imagine, what if the prodigal son, when he'd taken all his dad's money and went off and squandered it and did those things, we can imagine what the father could have done to make it where the prodigal son wouldn't have wanted to come back. I mean, that's not hard to imagine. Imagine he had a lot of servants in his house. Imagine he sent a servant to occasionally just check in and guilt trip the son. Your father knew that you would do this. Your father assumed, or here's some more money. He thought you would probably go through it. Or someone maybe, hey, what are you doing with your life? Right? What's going on with you? You're destroying your life. Now, again, there's times to speak truth, but there's also times when I say a certain thing, especially if I'm a certain person in a relationship, I'm going to step right into a pitfall. And the thing I want to have happen, which is restoration, the exact opposite's going to happen, and someone's going to revolt. So we're going to go through 4 of those today. So in James chapter 5, verse 19 through 20, the goal is to turn someone back. That's the goal. And so here's some pitfalls that we want to avoid. So I'm going to start with Matthew chapter 18. We'll be back in James, and Matthew 18 is in your bulletin, so you should be able to follow along there. You can turn there if you want. So Matthew 18, verse 15 through 17. I'm going to read the whole thing, and then we'll break it down slowly. Verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he won't listen, take one or two others with you, so that by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be established. If he doesn't pay attention to them, tell the church. If he doesn't pay attention even to the church, let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you. So how can we avoid pitfalls when trying to restore prodigals? So number 1 today, but number 7 on your notes. That's going to confuse me. I'm sorry if it confuses you. So number 7, practice discretion. Now, there are some areas in my life where I'm really good at discretion. There are some where I'm not as good at discretion. So when it comes to gift giving, especially if I am excited about the gift, I have real trouble not rubbing it in the person's face that I know what the gift is. So, for instance, for Mother's Day, I got my mom a Chromebook. And as I mentioned before, I'm a little bit of a nerd. And so when there's some new tech in our house, I get pretty excited about it. So I did a lot of research, found this Chromebook that I thought was really nice. And so a couple weeks ahead of time, it arrived. And I just said to my mom, I said, hey, got you a really good Mother's Day gift. And in a couple weeks, you'll know what it is. I don't know why. I found that really fun. I don't know if she did. She did end up liking it, but discretion, there are areas where I'm not as good at. But there are some areas where we have to be good. There are some areas that if we don't practice discretion, we could cause real harm. Notice what this says in Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, Christian, how often do we skip this step? How often, when someone wrongs us, do we go say, I'm going to have my Sunday school teacher do it, my preacher do it, or maybe we're not even interested in reconciliation. Maybe we just go talk about a person. Maybe we spread all sorts of gossip instead of what this says. If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone, because here's the pitfall. If we don't practice discretion, we could humiliate a person. If we don't practice discretion, we could be a stumbling block between them coming